Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode. I'm joined today by Stephanie Davies-Arai, who I'm very excited to speak with. And Stephanie is the founder and director of Transgender Trend, which is an organization that was established in 2015. It was the first ever UK organization to challenge the social and medical transition of children. They called for evidence-based healthcare for children experiencing gender-related distress and science-based teaching in schools. Stephanie was also awarded the British Empire Medal as Director of Transgender Trend for services to children in the late Queen's Jubilee birthday honors list. So I'm honored to have Stephanie here today. So first of all, Stephanie, just thank you so much for joining me and taking the time to speak with me.
Hi, Sasha, and thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just to start off our conversation, there was a slight coincidence yesterday, which was that I was doing one of these interview conversations with Jo Bartosh, the journalist, and I asked her about kind of the shutting down of Tavistock in the UK and something about, how that came about and what was the climate like, was the tide turning in the UK when it comes to gender treatment for children. And she brought up Transgender Trend, she brought up your name, and she said that Transgender Trend played a huge role in achieving the closing down of Tavistock, which was the gender clinic for children, if people don't know. So I thought maybe that would be a good starting off point to kind of jump in. If you could tell us a bit, especially us Americans who aren't as well informed about the situation over in the UK, what kind of happened with that? What was Transgender Trend's role in kind of bringing the Tavistock to an end?
Well, I think because we sort of made the debate happen in the UK, I think a lot of it was the fact that before we came along, you had newspaper reports of children being transitioned, often very young children in schools, and there was never any critical comment about it. It was all celebration. So it was one of the reasons I set up Transgender Trend, to provide that alternative voice in the media. And because I knew they wouldn't just contact me because I was a nobody, I had to make an organisation in order to do that, and then send out press releases, etc. So I think it started the conversation. It was something that I heard from a clinical professional quite early on, was that because there was now an organisation that was really supporting or advocating for caution and open debate and transparency on this subject and raising questions, they felt more confident of doing so. But I certainly wasn't. I mean, at the Tavistock, there was a whistleblower in 2014, Sue Evans. The lot of people within the Tavistock Clinic itself did an awful lot of work, and journalists as well. I think there were various things. We were the first to publish research by Michael Biggs that was groundbreaking. It showed negative results of 1 year being on puberty blockers, and that was then broadcast on our sort of flagship current affairs programme called Newsnight, BBC. That spread a lot more awareness. And then it was a meeting really at the House of Lords where I was speaking. Marcus Evans, who had been a governor at the Tavistock Clinic, was speaking, various other people. And at that meeting, a group of us got together. Sue Evans, who had worked at the Tavistock, she spoke from the floor. And we got together, and that was really where the idea for bringing the judicial review against the Tavistock came about. And Sue Evans, first of all, took on that role. So bringing a judicial review means that the Tavistock has to legally sort of defend themselves in a legal situation in the High Court. And then Kira Bell came along, and Kira Bell was a detransitioned young woman who regretted her treatment, felt that she was sort of fast-tracked into it, and her underlying mental health issues hadn't been properly considered. So she took on the case as the spokesperson, as the claimant in the case, and I was accepted or given permission to intervene in the case. So my part in that was really to bring it. An intervener has to bring in new evidence that hasn't already been presented to the court. So my evidence was around detransitioners and the cultural context from which these children were presenting at the Tavistock, because they'd been taught online and in schools gender identity as fact. They were arriving, girls were arriving at the clinic fully convinced they were really boys. And that cultural context, I think, has a huge part to play in why those numbers have skyrocketed over the last decade in referrals to the Tavistock. So I think some things I think are quite subtle. We do a lot of work behind the scenes, and other things are more public. But I think it was just to actually having an organisation. I see the organisation as advocating for kids who are a bit different and their right to be a bit different and to grow up with their fertility intact and to go through puberty before they, in order to reach adulthood.
Well, I'm curious if it was that element, the medical side of things, the sterilizing, that first caught your attention, that something was wrong here, or was it more to do with, as you said, the social elements that were convincing kids into this very strange mindset where suddenly you have this big cohort of girls coming in and, as you said, saying they really believe they are boys. And then you've got these professionals telling them, well, sure, you are, and we can make that happen in a physical way. So I'm curious about what it was that first kind of raised a red flag for you when it came to transgender issues in children.
But issues in children. I could not believe what I was reading, that, say, a 4 or 5-year-old boy in a primary school was being told that he was a girl by the teachers, by other pupils, by his family, by the whole community. And that, because my work up to that point had been with parents and teachers, for over 20 years I'd worked in communication skills in those areas. And the thing that really hit me was, this is the worst sort of parenting advice you could get, is to agree with your child when they have when what they're stating is so palpably not true. So, and it seemed to me to come out of a very child-led parenting model and that was the kind of parenting advice that really reached ascendancy over that decade previously. So it seemed to me that it was a sort of exaggerated idea that the child knows themselves best and the parent must follow the child. And we must, listening to children, fine, I agree with that, but that doesn't mean agreeing with the child with everything they say. And it's treating children as adults. So which is a huge red flag for me. It's what I would term abuse. If you're treating a child as if they have adult levels of development, understanding, and they don't. Of course, a child knows who they are as a 4-year-old. They don't know what's best for them at that age. They have all sorts of developmental processes to go through before they reach a stage where they're out of magical thinking, where they are able to weigh up risk and benefit in the future. It went against everything that we know about child development and psychology, and I could not believe that we were treating children in this way. But I think those two areas, it was health and education I was concerned with, and they're so wrapped up together because, of course, what was online has come down into schools now, and children are getting this message. According to gender identity ideology, those girls really are boys, because it's your gender identity that makes you a girl or a boy. It's not your biological sex. So according to that ideology, they are boys. And so if children are being taught that as fact in schools, then it's really not surprising that we have this huge soaring number of children who are really confused about whether they're girls or boys.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's what's frightening too is how easy it is really to confuse children and to make them think things that aren't quite right. I mean, while you were talking about the young kids, the 4 to 5 year olds, as they're exploring the world, and that it's a form of child abuse to treat them like they have adult references and understanding. I was thinking about a little 3 year old boy I used to babysit, and he would just sometimes, stand in the kitchen and point to everything and say, "What is that? What is that? What is that?" And he was so reliant on me to tell him what things were in his reality. He would even ask multiple times, as they do, about the same thing. But it gave me this sense of responsibility. Like, wow, it's really kind of heavy to have to make sure that I don't lead him astray, even with little things. It kind of settled on me that there is this real responsibility here. Why do some adults go into this, go down that path where they will confuse a child? I mean, are I'm sure they're probably not thinking of themselves that way, but why do you think some adults will do that? Will sort of tell kids that, the reality that is here now, that's not really reality. It's what you think
Mm.
that's the reality.
I mean, you're right. It's the adults in positions of authority and responsibility, and particularly parents, that build reality for the child. The child doesn't enter the world whole, knowing everything. Or, the child knows very little. But I think the parenting advice industry has an awful lot to answer for in that regard. That it's a hugely profitable and unregulated industry, and so the advice, as it's become more and more child led, it really pushes that idea that your child is somehow all knowing and wise, and that everything must be negotiated with the child, and everything and you need to follow the child to build the child's self-esteem. It changes the positions. The adult becomes the child and the child becomes the adult, and children given that level of responsibility, I think it's the idea that we must be nice and kind all the time and be our child's friend. And actually, children need us. Yeah, it's nice to be nice, but children also need us. They need, boundaries, discipline, rules, um, and they need us to be the adults, because that makes children feel secure. And the children who have parents who are continually looking to the child and negotiating everything with the child, those children are not happy children. They're not happy, confident children. They've been given a responsibility that they're not developmentally equipped to take, and it's not actually kind. So we've got this weird idea, but I think a lot of parents don't. It's not. They're not deliberately being cruel. They're parenting in the best way they know how. But I think there's an awful lot of bad advice out there for them.
Mhm. So there's this idea being told to parents that you let the child lead, you kind of let them tell you what is going on with them or what they should do and things like that. And
Mm.
parents are really internalizing this, and um
And you let the child make decisions, and you give the child lots of choices.
mm,
Now, choice is really stressful. Even as adults, it's sort of nice, better a lot of the time not to have too much choice, because the more choice you have, the more complicated the decision is. But also, some things are not a choice. Being a boy or a girl is not a choice. And this is where I think the parenting and the messages from society and from online sort of dovetail with the gender clinics. Puberty blockers, for example, are supposed to give children time to think about their choices. Well, they don't have that choice. They will never change sex. That's the reality. And the more we can do to help children come to terms with the sex that they were born, the more we'll be giving them, really helpful coping mechanisms and management strategies for those feelings of discomfort with themselves. But to me, agreeing with a little boy that he's a girl, or agreeing with a teenage girl that she's really a boy, is not kind. It's actually agreeing with the child that there's something wrong with them, that they're the wrong sex, they're born in the wrong body, and they're right to want to, that they need to change. And actually, the kind message is, no, you're fine as you are.
Mhm. Yeah, and so with these puberty blockers, as you mentioned, there's this idea of giving the kid time to think and time to make a decision. And it's very terrifying to hear that as for us who've gone through puberty and we're done with all that, and maybe we remember how scary and confusing it was. And the thought of having to make that choice for myself is so insane because some kids have a bit of that Peter Pan syndrome. They don't want to grow up. I remember feeling a bit afraid to grow up as puberty was coming on. So to give that child the choice when really it's not a choice because, as you said, you cannot change whether you're a boy or a girl. Um, it does make me wonder what that is doing to their psyche, how stressful that must be really for them to have to be there making that impossible choice for them. It's like a choice to overcome nature, overcome, God's will, to put it in one way. But, putting all that on their shoulders, it's how do they conceptualize that? I mean, what's going on with them? That must be very stressful.
And not just for the child themselves, but if in a school situation, for every other child in the school, because every other child in the school is being given the same message. You have a choice whether you grow up to be a man or a woman. And for an awful lot of other children, that suddenly means they have to question themselves. And we have this idea is being promoted in schools that somehow it's a good, positive thing to allow children to, in quotes, explore their gender identity. And I look at that and I think, why? Why is that good? Because what that actually means is that every child is examining and analysing every aspect of their personality, their likes, their dislikes, their interests, what they like to wear, according to gender. Does that make me a boy or a girl? And it's based on stereotypes. But to me, that's not a healthy way. That's not something that's healthy that we're encouraging in children. It's a very navel-gazing time during adolescence anyway. Really, we'd be better encouraging children to look outside themselves and to take part in activities and do things, and not sit there ruminating on who am I, as much as teenagers naturally do. But it really catches teenagers at that age where, if you're, and I think particularly for girls, and it's part of the reason we've seen such a huge rise in the number of girls, that as soon as one girl has the choice of being a boy, well, that impacts on every other girl who hates her body, who's really uncomfortable with herself, as most teenagers are, who feels that that she doesn't have, or she experiences sexism, she experiences sexual harassment, for example, that boys don't. It's not much fun being a girl, and particularly I think in this really pornified culture that we live in now, I think it's really tough, and the high ideals and social media. So all of that makes it very difficult for a girl to feel comfortable in herself, more difficult than it used to be, and more critical of herself. So for all of those girls, looking at another girl in the class who's decided to opt out of all of that and be a boy instead, well, that looks good. Oh, it's a choice. And it's actually not. it's not a choice that these girls have. And that's where it's so wrong to give children that message that of that false choice, when it takes maturity, it takes growing up to. You need to be at a stage of life where you can look back and see what the influences were on you during your teenage and early adult years. You don't know that you are being influenced by your peers, by your culture. You're not being influenced by your parents so much during that period of life anymore. You're possibly rebelling against your parents' values. And so you're very vulnerable to all the messages that your culture sends you. You're very susceptible to believing what you hear, and particularly if your teachers in school are reinforcing that message that it's true, it's reality. How are it's very. I think it's almost impossible for teenagers to unpick what their, whether influences are good or bad, whether they really agree with them or not, until they've moved, quite a bit beyond that stage of life.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's such a good point you bring up about how when one child goes down this path, it opens up the choice or the possibility really for everybody. And I hadn't thought of it in that way necessarily with the social contagion, because I often hear about the elements of social contagion where the kids, particularly girls, as you said, are inspired to want to achieve that particular goal. They want to, look like that other kid, or they want to act like that or be a boy. But what you're saying is that also, in addition to that, it's just given them the possibility of escaping the issues that whatever it is that they're dealing with.
And we know that social contagion happens overwhelmingly with teenage girls, because teenage girls tend to take on each other's feelings by osmosis. There's that kind of empathy. If one girl gets depressed, then the whole circle of friends become depressed. It's much more than with boys. But also the case in schools is that to become trans or non-binary, to have a gender identity, it seems to be the one way now that teenagers can show that they're rebelling, or they're non-conformist. In fact, it's conforming to stereotype. But teenagers used to have very different ways of showing the world that they didn't follow the rules. They were non-conformist. They weren't boring. They weren't stereotypical, and they become emos or goths or punks. And now it seems the only sort of counterculture they can join is different gender identities. And if you get, particularly with older girls in school, say there's a girl or a couple of girls in the sixth form who are now trans or non-binary, that will influence the girls in the younger years looking up to them. And you achieve a certain status in schools for being trans or non-binary. Rather than a boring old cis het child, or rather than being a lesbian or gay, to be trans is the latest thing. And it's a way of achieving status for yourself, particularly if you've never felt that you're accepted or included in the group before. That's one way of doing it. So there's a lot of reasons there that, if we know anything about social relationships and the social hierarchies that are being played out in schools, we should be, we can do a tick box of all the things that are happening there that would encourage more and more children to declare themselves trans.
Mm-hmm. And there's this whole concept that you raised of cis, right? So once there's one kid who's trans, everybody else is cis, and cis is not cool. It's not interesting. It's actually in the oppressive minority. So not only are you kind of lame, but you're actually like somehow part of this evil patriarchal system that's oppressing the underdog. So it immediately, without you even doing anything, positions you on against the sort of idea of the underdog in a way. So what kid would want to be in that group?
It's, yeah, you see signs, die cis scum,
Mm-hmm.
and cis het. They're terms of contempt. And yes, you're the evil side. You're not on the right side of history if you're cis, or you're boring. You haven't got well, I have seen a cis flag. It's stripes of grey. It's got no colour
Yeah,
in it because you're
right,
just boring. Or,
right.
but there's such a range of every identity has its flag. And, for teenagers in their critical years for identity development, and what teenagers do um, in that process of developing self-identity, they join a group, and they adopt the group identity and follow the group rules. And it used to be mostly in music, whether you liked heavy metal, or you liked punk, or you liked emo. It was music based, and you'd wear the uniform of that tribe, that gang. Um, and your parents would laugh at you for being the same as everyone else when you thought you were being so different. But it's a natural stage of identity development that first you integrate into the group or the tribe. And then bit by bit, as you grow up, you start to individuate, and you stop following all the rules, and you develop your own self-identity. You might retain some of the things from that time, but very few of us are still very few of us still have the same identity in that way as we did when we were teenagers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you said, sometimes people will say to the kids who are goth or emo or whatever it is, oh, but you're just conforming. You look exactly like everybody else in that group. But the thing is, they are differentiating from, their family, they're definitely not conforming to what they used to be a part of. So in a way, I guess, like you said, it's on that path to individuation later on. It's kind of their first step.
It's a necessary stage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's definitely, I think, not too hard to understand why teenage girls in particular can fall into this mindset. They definitely have this angst. I remember having this teenage angst. When I was a teenager, and I've talked about this before, I was part of the social contagion of cutting. I actually did that when I was a young teenager, and I learned later that the years that I was in high school were the exact years where that behavior tripled among teen girls in the US. And I learned that when I was reading Abigail Schreier's book, and I was like, wow, those were the exact years I was in high school. My goodness, I didn't even know that I was part of a social contagion. So I can completely understand how girls fall into this. What's hard for me to understand is the medical part, the surgeries, the choices to do that. That just is so much more severe than the social contagion I mentioned, cutting. I don't know if you could say it's more severe than something like anorexia, but I don't know exactly how to compare those. But that's the part that I do still struggle to understand when I try to put myself in the mindset of these teenage girls. Why do they, and certainly not to put the blame on them, the blame rests on the surgeons and the people who are pushing, the adults who should be protecting them. But why do they want to go so far as to remove their breasts and do something so irreversible to their bodies?
Well, again, so many teenage girls really struggle with developing breasts because it's the most visible sign of being a woman, and it's the part of the body that gets the most attention that girls maybe not be emotionally ready for, if they ever should be, because some of that attention is not pleasant and some of it is frightening. So a lot of girls struggle with the development of breasts. And you hear a lot from girls who've had double mastectomies. What they wanted was to be able to go on the beach like the boys did without a top on. And you can understand that as a teenager, that is the only thing that's important to you, nothing else at all, because you live very much in the moment, in your peer group, in the moment. You're not looking towards the future. You're not thinking, Will I always feel this way and regret it? And you're not thinking, will I want to have a child at some point and to be able to breastfeed my own baby? Because you're not at the life stage to be able to be. Those things are not important to you. You don't really understand, I think, until becoming a mother, possibly, that what connection there is in breastfeeding, being able to breastfeed your baby, and the connection with your baby. You have no understanding of that at all. And so that's another reason why we do protect children from making decisions that will affect them for the rest of their lives and that are irreversible. I mean, in this country, we don't allow tattoos until age 18. And yet we're giving puberty blockers to children at age 10. And, with impacts on some impacts that we do know and some that we don't, but very worrying research on brain development, on bone density development. And of course, most of the children who are put onto puberty blockers then go on to cross-sex hormones. It doesn't give them time to think at all. It seems to solidify the identity. And if you imagine a child that's being affirmed everywhere from all of the adults that child trusts that they really are the opposite sex, and then they go on to puberty blockers that keeps them in that child's body, they're so far down that path that I think there must come a point where it is psychologically irreversible. We talk about we say, oh, puberty blockers are fine because they're reversible. We don't know that. We don't know. There are windows of learning within puberty, and we don't know. We know from trials on sheep that if the window is missed, it's for spatial memory. Even if puberty blockers are stopped, that doesn't come back. We don't know what else is irreversible. We really have no idea what we're doing to children's bodies, because it's not just secondary sex characteristics that are affected. Those sex hormones at puberty, the flood of sex hormones affects every single part of your body. Every cell in your body is affected by those hormones. And the body needs those hormones in order for the person to grow and develop into adulthood. It affects every single part of your body. And really, we don't know what's reversible and what's irreversible. But I think that whole process of so-called social transition, which is gender affirmation, I'm sure there is a point where it's psychologically irreversible, because the child has been loved and celebrated and supported, and so many people have fought their corner for them, called other people bigots who don't agree with it, have told them that they're the most marginalised, vulnerable community, and yet somehow also the most special. And so many people are invested in that child's transition, that I think it becomes impossible for the child themselves to actually turn around and go back, because they're making people look like idiots. The shame of it. I made such a huge fundamental mistake. I misled you all. I'm going to be laughed at, and it's, I'm sort of, making the rest of you look like idiots as well. It's huge for a child at that stage of development, whether they're a teenager or a younger child. I think there must come a point where you've gone so far down that path that it's psychologically impossible to reverse from it.
Yeah, so some girls may just start with the breast removal, but what you're saying is that many girls are started so much earlier that's not even, it's not like they just woke up one day and went to such a drastic measure. So the word that comes to mind, which is I've never used this word before on this topic, but grooming, because the reason I haven't used it is because it's thrown around so much, especially with conservative American politics, where everybody's a groomer, everybody gets accused of grooming. However, what you were describing perhaps is a shade of grooming. Maybe it's unintentional, but it is starting with this child at on sort of small steps, maybe social transition, pronouns, things like that. And then puberty blockers, it might seem like a small step because, like you're saying, the body's starting to grow and develop, and maybe you want to just keep it small. I know that I remember thinking I was getting fat at puberty, but it was just my hips growing. And I can understand that as a sort of like step by step process until you're mired in it. And how can you then turn around and tell everyone, sorry, no, can we reframe everything again?
I don't think the pronouns and the social transition is a small step. I think it's the start, and every child that goes on to puberty blockers, I think, has been socially affirmed as the opposite sex. I don't think there's any way they could get to that point without that. And I think it's the first step that's the biggest, that causes the harm, because it's the first step that is the initial lie that we're telling to children. And from that, everything else follows from that. So, we're always being told, oh, what harm is it to use a child's preferred pronouns? Completely reversible. No, it's a hugely significant psychological intervention. It's massive. It's it results in everything else. So that, and the more we can accept children and allow them to express themselves as they want to, but not take that state that really crosses a boundary, telling a girl that she is a boy or telling a boy he is a girl. That just crosses a line into an area that will potentially cause harm to that child. We need to stay the other side of that line and allow children, allow teenagers to express themselves, to present themselves in whatever way they want, but not cross that line into telling them lies.
Mm-hmm. I want to continue to ask you about sort of more of the motivations behind some of the adults in these situations, but I also just really quickly wanted to ask you about, you referenced the sheep. Were there, because I'm not familiar with that, were there studies with sheep and puberty blockers?
Yes, yeah. So yeah, in the UK they did trials on sheep, and those trials have finished now. But yes, they found that, and they use sheep because apparently they're the closest mammal to humans in terms of puberty, when they start puberty and how long they go through it. So yes, and it showed that the sheep who had the puberty blockers and then went off the puberty blockers didn't regain that spatial memory. They couldn't remember. So that's one part of brain development, that there's clearly a window for that. We know there are windows for language learning and at various stages of development, but that was one stage of cognitive development in puberty that the sheep didn't get back.
Mm-hmm. And was that done, were the puberty blockers given to the sheep, sorry if I missed it, if you already said this, as they were going through puberty or before? And the reason I ask is just because I know with some kids, they're given these puberty blockers because they had, I guess, early puberty. And so I'm just wondering if that's any different, or if that applies.
Yeah, it's difficult. So the sheep were given the puberty blockers at the stage that children are for gender dysphoria. So Tanner stage 2 of puberty, which is basically when it just starts being visible. The puberty blockers are used for precocious puberty. So the studies that we've seen for those blockers in any other condition there are worrying results for children, but you can't. And there are studies, for example, showing a drop in IQ points, and that can be a drop in about 8 IQ points, and that can be really serious. That can take you down a level, in terms of your intelligence. We've also seen all sorts of reports. It's Lupron, I think, that's used in the US. Triptyline is the equivalent used in the UK. But they all do the same thing. So we've seen terrible reports from women who were given, because it's mostly girls who are given this drug for precocious puberty because they go through it's very, very early. And we've seen really awful lifelong results from those reports of those from women. But you can't take a drug that's used for a physical condition, completely different condition, and transfer it onto something completely new. Because in that case, if there are advantages to what the drug does for you in early puberty, so you're in when you're a child, when you've got very, very early puberty, and then the child comes off the puberty blockers, and they resume in about a year's time. They resume puberty at the normal range of age for and there haven't, there've been studies but I don't think also in that indication there's been enough research done. There are studies showing a drop in IQ points. There's studies. It's a drug that's given to men for prostate cancer because it blocks the testosterone for men, and you have results of studies in men showing memory loss, depression, mental confusion. So the results in all sorts of indications for this. It's a very, very powerful drug.
Mm-hmm. And if it is giving the kids more depression and more confusion, I mean, God, that's the last thing that they need on top of the social and internal confusion that they're already dealing with. And then what about these adults who are doing this? What's going on in their minds? Are they, full believers? Are they psychopaths? This is hard for me to understand as well.
Well, again, I think it's a social thing. And this particular time in history, that one, it's the idea of being kind, which I think is very misplaced. There's the change in the relationship where the child is the adult and the adult is the child. You see that in clinicians as well as and other adults as well as parents. I think I don't really understand this, but I think there is genuine belief in the idea of gender identity, that somehow these children are magic children, and who have this inner knowing that they're male or female. I don't really understand how, why so many. I think there are people who are afraid to say anything, but we're not talking about them, are we? We're talking about the ones who are really enthusiastic about it and think it's a great thing. And I really can't understand it, because as soon as you start thinking it through, the illogicality of it is exposed really quickly. That it's an ideology. It's not based on reality. But I think partly that the internet has a lot to answer for spreading ideas which may have remained in a little box somewhere, or in a little corner, or in academia somewhere. All of these ideas have been spread very, very quickly. So I think that's been a sort of mass social contagion of adults as well as the children. And we haven't yet really understood the power of the internet to do that.
That's really interesting, because as that Pandora's box was opened, it affected the grown-ups too, not just the kids. And like you said earlier about how when one kid opens up or shows that there's a possibility of doing this, it opens the possibility to everyone. And I think that is what's happened. And there are definitely a lot of well-meaning adults who really believe this is, as you said, kindness. And they won't hear a word against it. That's the interesting thing. You know, they think that people who are questioning it are bigoted. Have you encountered that? Have you encountered anybody try to silence you or shut you up or anything along the way?
Yes, it's something that I'm called all the time, which I ignore. But it is horrible because it's a constant message. But I haven't been. I think in a way I'm uncancelable because I haven't got anything to be cancelled from. I'm not. I was always self-employed in my work, and I think when I look back, I think I lost writing, platforms who previously published my writing. I think I potentially lost some schools where I was going into work. The more that I focused on this, and it became a full-time job very quickly because there was so much demand for an organisation like Transgender Trend in the UK. So as soon as I started, I spent a lot of time, often on the phone to really distressed parents who hadn't found anybody else that they could talk to who would understand and who would know that they weren't being bigots.
Mm-hmm.
So, replying to parents' emails and really being a support for parents. Now, of course, there are parent groups that do that. It's taken a lot off my shoulders, really. They're fantastic. There's a couple of really great parenting groups in the UK, Bayswater and Our Duty. So I can't remember what the what the original question was now.
Well, I mean, I don't either, but one thing that you brought up that I wanted to ask you was, oh yeah, about bigot, people calling
Oh,
you a bigot
yes.
and all that.
Yeah. So I think, anybody now can Google my name and they will find. I don't know what happens when I'm online so much. I've done so many talks and interviews and various things. I'm all over the place, but you'd probably get a few pieces about me being a transphobic bigot, and Transgender Trend is a trans hate group coming up as well. So anybody searching me to employ me would find all that online very quickly. And so I'm sure it has had an impact on my employability status and with other work that I was doing. But I am getting schools contacting me and asking me to come in and do training. And that's happened more and more. So it's something that I do. I think that's quite interesting that I don't tend to broadcast it because we're still in a position where schools would be attacked for employing me to come in and do training rather than Stonewall or Mermaids.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? Where the school or the organization will get attacked by the mob, and then after having already thought it was a great idea to bring on a critical voice, then maybe they'll decide it's time to deplatform or something like that from the pressure from the mob. But I definitely think that the more they try to label you a bigot, probably the more people will hear of your work, especially I know for people in the US who are listening, you're very well known in the UK on this topic, and so hopefully more people in the US can also understand the nuances and the complexities of this issue, because even as it has exploded into the mainstream, it's very much you've got the liberals and you've got the conservatives, and so there's still not necessarily a space to actually discuss these issues from the psychological perspective or the health of the children in a more in a compassionate way without using your own political agenda and all that.
Yeah, I'm really apolitical. I don't really like politics. I'm not really interested in politics so much as the cultural and social. I know it's all connected, but I'm I think, you know, I look at this and I know that it's painted as a very political issue. If you're on the left, you're the good guy and you support this. If you're on the right, you're a bad guy. And I just, you know, it's not a party political issue. It's not a political issue. It's a safeguarding issue. And so I think I come from a good position to be working, and my subject being children, because I'm genuinely not political. I like intelligence, whichever side it comes from. I'll listen to anybody, as long as they're thoughtful and you know, intelligent. And I think, you know, people who've got principles, I like. But you know, whether they, you know, whether people vote left or right, or whether, you know, I don't care. I don't care what people's political opinions are. My concern is safeguarding, and so I think I try and maintain that space that is actually, you know, I will read things from, you know, so for example, when I started doing this, the situation in the UK was really, really no debate at all. It was incredibly difficult just to even ask a question. So I couldn't come in, and I wouldn't anyway, because it's not my personality. I couldn't come in blazing, this is child abuse, you know, or the rest of it. It wouldn't have worked. Had to come in very, very carefully. But I am quite careful. I am, you know, naturally quite careful. You know, I've always felt that my responsibility is to present, as far as I know, fact-based evidence that I can back up what I say with some evidence. I'm very careful about claiming something that I can't defend. You know that. So I want to keep a space where these issues can be discussed on a you know, a non-sensationalist, a non angry or you know, extreme way, and just allow that debate to happen in the space that I think it should happen, which is a fairly neutral space. When you're talking about children, you know, we have to be adults. We have to recognise that, you know, I don't want to replace one ideology with another by coming in and saying, no, it's got to be this way. I'm always aware of not claiming to be an authority on an area that I don't really know about. So I you know, I try and stick with what I do, with what I do know, with my area of expertise. But yeah, but it's part of the story, isn't it? It's part of the narrative that's been spun right from the start from activist organisations who've worked for a long time on this, to have a particular narrative about trans kids in inverted commas, and you know, being kind to trans kids. I've been accused of trying to kill them. So that extreme narrative has come, you know, from that side. And it's interesting to me how, if you're moving back towards reality, you can be seen as being in the extreme position yourself.
That is really interesting. When there's a illusion that has seized a lot of people, the person who's standing in the reality is seen as the crazy one, I guess, in a way. So we're reaching the end of our hour, and it's been a wonderful conversation. I want to end with just one last question about basically, what do you say, or what would you say to parents right now who are struggling, who are listening, who do not want their kids to become sterilized and deal with all these health issues and, have to live this lie, or have to attempt to live this lie? What would you say to those parents? Any, words of
Well,
advice?
one bit of parenting advice that I think is true and it is really good is what you focus on becomes stronger. So, this is really sort of traditional parenting advice. If you focus too much on the bad behaviour, the child will carry on behaving badly because that's what gets you. That's what gets them your attention, even if it's negative attention. And so, I would advise parents. I always think you try as much as possible to deal with your own issues before you deal with your child's. In other social contagions, so in the UK there was a social contagion, mostly teenage girls again, with Tourette's syndrome or tics over lockdown, and the advice on that was really starkly different to the advice with gender dysphoria. It was to actually take the focus off, talk about other things, don't react. Don't pay attention. Don't give all your attention. Don't become really. I know it's difficult. Don't get obsessed with gender. Try and keep your life and your relationship with your child about other things that are more interesting than gender. Talk to them about world issues. Talk to them about, interesting things you've done that day or whatever it is. Talk about different subjects, keep up the relationship and the communication, and don't focus on gender yourself, because what you focus on, what you give your attention to, tends to continue and become stronger.
Interesting. So it's not about refuting every little point and about getting in there and fighting the ideology at all.
I think it's particularly with teenagers, don't think you have to win every argument. If you do, I think it is important for parents to tell their children the reality. They're possibly the only adults in their child's life who will do that. But I think with teenagers, it's better to do it in a fairly matter-of-fact way, rather than trying to, lay it on with a trowel. You've got to believe this. Doesn't matter if you lose an argument. In fact, if you listen to your child and you say, oh, that's interesting, but you think that, because I think this, and you keep it at that level, it becomes a conversation that you can have without getting it, and let them win it. What does it matter? Because I always think if you allow a child to go away after you've argued something out, you've always planted a seed. And with teenagers, they need a little bit of space to let that seed grow and then claim it as their own idea. It's a tricky, we walk that line with teenagers, whatever the issue is, whatever the problem is. It's no different to any other issue in that sense. But of course, the terrifying thing for parents is the medical treatment that is looming on the horizon. And so they feel with this one, they've really got to sort it out and deal with it. But I think you have to be a bit clever with how you keep up the communication and the good relationship with your child, and let it go if they're insisting on something, and give them a little bit of space. So it's, keeping that position of yourself as the adult who does know more in this area than they do, but having quite a light touch with that, so that it's not felt by the child as lecturing. You're not treating them as if they're stupid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So using a light touch and keeping that communication open, the relationship, and trying to get them interested in other things as well. Really good advice. Really interesting to hear. And so, Stephanie, thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Did you want to add something?
It's something I say to parents. It's very useful to have to to practice your goes without saying voice.
Mm.
So you make a statement of fact and you make it in the tone of voice like goes without saying. It's so matter of fact. I mean, everybody knows that. It's sort of that tone of voice where you've got you're so comfortable in your authority, to say that, and then you change the subject and go on to something else because it doesn't need a big discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're communicating there is trust in their intelligence. We're not, trust that they don't need lecturing to. They'll get it. They're not stupid. And teenagers more than anything want us to trust them.
So it's entirely different from kind of being on the back foot and being defensive and trying to battle all those ideas.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which is why I say sort it out in your own head before beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, really interesting. Thank you, Stephanie. You've given me a lot to think about, and I had a great time. So we'll just wrap this up now. I just want to say thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Sasha. It was lovely to talk to you.